Tēnā koutou. I am Rob Morrison. I chair Pure Advantage, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening for the evening session. And for those of you who have been here all day, congratulations, well done. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And for those of you joining us, welcome. It's been a great day. It really has been a good day. I also want to welcome the online audience. Some people here have been online all day. I think we've had, according to Simon, over 300 people online, but we're also joined by people from all around the world in terms of the online sessions, people in Sydney, London, good morning to you, the US, Costa Rica, hola. It's a global audience. And that's fantastic, and it is, I think, congratulations to everyone who has helped put this conference on. I think in particular Peter Berg and the trustees of Tane's Tree Trust, the trustees at Pure Advantage, but in particular Simon Miller. He does all the work and we get to speak, and that's fantastic. And the Tyndall Foundation and Stephen Tyndall for all of his support, but also all the sponsors who have helped make this possible. And Izzy Fenwick, who is able to relax this evening, thanks for keeping everyone in line. And it's my job to do that tonight with Tim Flannery. And that's not an easy job. I did want to start by just going through a couple of points that have been raised today and covering those really from a Pure Advantage point of view, because we are very interested in this space. We have been interested for quite a period of time, and we've pushed quite hard with the government in terms of making some changes around the way the forestry issue, but particularly the native forestry issue has been approached. And we're certainly on record as saying that the ETS as it's currently structured is not fit for purpose. And Rod Carr spoke to that this morning. He described the architecture as requiring some work. Our view is that it's simply not fit for purpose, and the reasoning behind that is that it does miss, and James Shaw had said this too, that it misses most of New Zealand's current budgeted emissions. It's not materially reducing New Zealand's emission profile, which is the really critical issue. Despite the hopes of some today, it's markets are not an efficient price mechanism or allocator of capital if regulations tilt the playing field. They're simply an opportunity for people to make money. And I know that, having been an investment banker for 30 or 40 years, markets love nothing more than an opportunity to make money because the regulations are tilted one way or the other. And it's not the right mechanism. It is the ETS encouraging the misallocation of capital investment in the forest categories, as discussed a lot today. It's heavily weighted in favour of exotic plantings at the expense of indigenous forestry. And at its core, and Tim and I will cover this a bit later, at its core, its offset mechanism is misaligned with the way it allocates offsets related to the release of carbon into the atmosphere. And I think one of the really key points that has also been discussed today, it doesn't allow for biodiversity. There's no biodiversity mechanism in the ETS, and that's an enormous failure in terms of what as a country we should be trying to achieve, not least of which is that the Australians appear to be ahead of us at the moment, and that is not a position that we should take lightly. James Shaw this morning said it's all about trees, more trees, more trees, more trees. And I'm sure he didn't really mean it that way. Maybe he did. He said it several times. But it's certainly not about more trees. It's way too simplistic. It's sort of analogous with saying we needed more subprime ahead of the GFC. Subprime instruments were useful things. They fitted part of the criteria in terms of providing debt for companies and investment. They were short-term in focus. They were very easy to get into. You could make a lot of money from them. They proliferated rapidly, like a weed. I think in 2006 there were 5 AAA industrial companies. There were something like 800 AAA subprime issuances. There was as much value in a AAA rating as there was in a packet of batteries. But nevertheless, they filled a market gap until they collapsed. And the world spent years, and we still are, recovering from the GFC. And the issue around trees, and simply more trees, is that New Zealand's currently trying to fill a gap which is of our own making. We did not tackle our emissions profile. We have waited far too long to actually actively reduce emissions. We know we could have done it much sooner, but we didn't. We were faced as a country and as a government with a predicament heading into Glasgow, into COP26, because we knew that our existing pledge was not going to cut the mustard, so we introduced a new pledge, a new NDC in Glasgow, along with a number of other countries. We weren't the only one. And as you know, that was a reduction of gross emissions by 50% by 2030. So on the face of it, that sort of looked good and fine, except for the fact that we're not currently capable, under our current emissions profile, of meeting that. So we're left with a shortfall, and again, James Shaw discussed that. It's not a rounding error, it's 100 million tonnes of carbon equivalent. And that shortfall, as he admitted, currently will probably be met by accessing overseas markets, overseas ETSs, of which at the moment there are only 2 with any volume, California and Europe, the European ETS, and acquiring offshore credits. On the current price and potential future price, OECD predicts a tonne of carbon to be €200 by 2030. On the current price, that's a price tag of somewhere between 10 billion New Zealand dollars and 30 billion New Zealand dollars. And how anybody thinks that is a solution that would be fine for the taxpayers of New Zealand for us to spend that sort of money buying offsets overseas is beyond me. But we created this. And to simply go, well, we just need more trees to fix that problem is not the solution. It's definitely not the solution. Now, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out that we would be better off taking that money and investing it back into New Zealand than investing it into solutions here in Aotearoa. TK Jew said this morning we want more natives. So we want more native trees, we want more Indigenous planting, but we don't have the finance, and I get that. I think that's an issue. But again, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to join up the dots and go, why don't we bring that contingent liability onshore and start incentivising the planting of Indigenous forests? We don't need these transition phases that were talked about today. We should eliminate the transition phases and go straight to the establishment of actual permanent native forestry sinks, utilising the extraordinary trees that New Zealand has. And we have the money. It's just a matter of where we want to spend it. David Rhodes, in his presentation, aside from taking pot shots at Pure Advantage, which is acceptable, he quoted the Paris Article 4 offsetting as legitimate. But he admitted all the caveats that went with the legitimacy of establishing offsets in terms of the additionality, the permanence of those offsets, how you measure it and how it's enforceable. So if we're going to establish permanent carbon sinks, permanent forestry carbon sinks, you don't just go and set them up and say that's permanent. It has to come with forestry management plans. It has to come with caveats and penalties if you don't meet those plans. And it has to come with equivalency in terms of the way those offsets are going to be measurable against the carbon that they're supposed to be offsetting. What we know is that if you don't have trees that will live for a very long period of time, that's not a viable offset. If we set up a permanent carbon sink, which you can't cut the trees down for 50 years, we may as well call that the 50-year tree category, because that's what it is. It is not a permanent carbon sink. That's an oxymoron if we think we can use Pinus radiata as a permanent carbon sink. And again, Tim and I will discuss this a little bit later, but Dame Ann this morning, when she spoke about this, is absolutely right. This issue won't get decided in New Zealand. We won't decide ultimately what's right or not right in terms of carbon offsets and the permanence of what we think should go into creating those offsets. That's going to be established by international science, but also by international public opinion. And if we're not up there, then New Zealand will miss out. We won't decide this issue here on our own. Might suit us, but we won't decide that issue on our own. That's going to be decided only if we're credible globally, and we have to be credible globally. So those are views you can put up on a slide if you want to talk about pure advantage, because those are our views. One of the things that we have done today was to bring my great friend Tim Flannery to New Zealand. It's fair to say Tim did not want me to introduce him tonight. And the reason for that is that 2 months ago I introduced him at another conference, and I happened to remind him that the Bledisloe Cup Rugby was on at the time and Australia was not doing very well. And he said, just wait until the cricket. He rang me the other day to say, is the conference cancelled? Try the netball. You're going to have more luck there. Tim has had an extraordinary career. I love introducing him because each time, I've known him for a long time. He was almost a friend of my father's. He started life as a paleontologist. You know, that's Ross from Friends. And he worked in Australia and Melanesia and New Guinea through the late 70s and early 80s. He identified and described an enormous number of unidentified species with very long names. I can't pronounce most of them, but including things like tree kangaroos, but also fossils, 29 species of fossils. Sir David Attenborough described him as in the league of the all-time great explorers. He's been honoured on lots of different occasions, but honoured with newfound species being named after him, including Pterodopex Flannery. Okay, now you all know what that is. That is the greater monkey-faced bat. And apparently the bat was not very happy with the implied likeness. As he worked in these areas, particularly in the highlands in Papua New Guinea, he started to notice the impact on vegetation, which ultimately he realised was climate change. And he moved, he switched, I guess, careers. He's still extraordinarily interested in paleontology, still very interested in mammals, but he became extraordinarily passionate, thankfully for us, about climate change, and was instrumental, I think, in helping to change the debate, not just in Australia but elsewhere. I got to know him when I was working in Asia, and we were together in Bali at COP13, and then Tim established the Copenhagen Climate Council, which I was a member of, and ahead of COP15. And that in itself is probably, thinking about that, is it shows how many opportunities we've missed, given that Glasgow was COP26 and our emissions pass is way worse than where we thought we were back at COP15 in Copenhagen. But we had a lot of fun together. I think hopefully we did a few good things together. He is a tremendous human being. He's an enormously gifted character, and it really is my great pleasure to ask Tim to come and address us this evening. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Rob. That was a great introduction. The only thing I'll say is that I never seem to get invited to New Zealand when the wallabies look like they're on form. I don't know what... But we'll leave it at that. But look, I've had a tremendous day here with you all. What a great conference, a fabulous and timely conference. And I think this conference has the potential to be the moment that we'll look back on as the time the tide started to turn, as we started to take New Zealand's tremendous biodiversity and its forests more seriously in the context of climate change and carbon sequestration. I listened with great interest this morning as Dr. Rod Carr, who's the head of the New Zealand Climate Commission, spoke about just how severe the climate crisis has become. And I thought I'd just spend a couple of minutes really emphasising some of the points he made. You know, back when Rob and I were working in Copenhagen trying to make COP15 a success, we knew back then that that was really our last chance pretty much to develop a smooth glide path of emissions reductions that would see us below 1.5 degrees of warming, see us peak at below 1.5 degrees of warming. Unfortunately, we failed at that time, and since then the trajectory has been horrific. In those, I guess, 13 years, humanity has added almost 1/3 of all carbon emissions that we have ever put into the atmosphere as a species from burning fossil fuels. Can you imagine that? Almost 33%. So the situation today is one where, you know, we had a glide path in 2009, we no longer have that. Emissions reductions today look more like falling off a cliff than a gentle glide to 1.5 degrees. In fact, all 5 projections of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC show that the global temperatures will reach 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average within the next decade or so. And there's nothing we can do to avoid that. That is the reality. The best we can now hope for is to see emissions peak at 1.8 to 1.9 degrees above the pre-industrial average sometime later this century, and then start dropping as we develop what are at the moment unknown drawdown technologies, at least at the scale we required. But if we're to achieve that, we need truly drastic action now. We need to be cutting our emissions, our sources of emissions, by 8% per year for a decade, and to simultaneously withdraw CO2 out of the air. We need to start at least developing the means of doing that, so a century from now we'll be able to do it at scale. They're enormously challenging figures. And for countries like Australia and New Zealand, they become even more challenging because we realise that we are developed, affluent countries that have to lead. It's not like asking India or Egypt or any of the other less developed countries to make cuts on that scale. We have to actually lead with our cuts in the hope that we give them enough breathing space to follow. I just want to make a point here that in that sense, the sense that climate scientists understand the problem, the days of offsetting are really, they're really over, because we know what we need to do now is to cut emissions at 8% per year for a decade, but also start laying the groundwork for large-scale drawdown of CO2. So it's not like you can say, oh, look, we'll put a little bit of CO2 up here and we'll take a little bit down there. We're not in that world anymore. We're in a world where we need to do two very hard things at the same time if we hope to peak below 2 degrees of warming. And I should just say the reason we need to do that is because we are fast approaching Earth's tipping points. A paper, a very important scientific paper published just a fortnight or so ago in the journal Nature, made the point that once we hit 1.5 degrees, 5 of the Earth's 23 or so tipping points go from being possible to being likely. Right? So things like the Arctic ice melt, the tundra meltdown, alteration of the Earth's ocean currents, they go from being possible to likely. I just want to turn now to a much more optimistic issue, which is the potential that New Zealand has in a very real way to contribute to this immense challenge. There are things that this country can be doing right now to start reducing its emissions. One surely is in transport. Electrification of transport is now the logical pathway forward. It really is. We don't need to be buying fossil fuels, oil and so forth from dictatorships and so forth in order to run our transport. Electric vehicles are here now. We can start from heavy transport onto motor vehicles, public transport. We can start making a difference now, and within a decade or so have made a big difference in terms of our emissions from transport. The other great asset that this country has, well, before I say that, I should just say that the other problem the country has is that your emissions from hard to abate sectors like methane and nitrous oxide, technologies are being developed right now that can help there. Things like the use of seaweed, Asparagopsis seaweed, to absorb methane from the rumen of cattle. Those sort of things we need to start really honing in on and making sure that New Zealand is in the forefront of taking advantage of those opportunities. If you don't, your market share of product is likely to decline because the world doesn't want carbon-intense product anymore. But the other great thing you have in this country are your incredible forests and exceptional biodiversity. You know, every time I land in New Zealand, I feel like I'm almost travelling to another planet, as Jared Diamond says. You know, the last time New Zealand and Australia were joined was 90 million years ago. That was before the dinosaurs became extinct. So subsequent to the dinosaur extinction, in most of the world, the mammals inherited the Earth. Here in New Zealand, the birds did. So if you want a separate experiment in evolution, you want to understand what the world might have been like had things been a little bit different, this is where you come to study. It is the most precious asset in my understanding that this nation has, is its biodiversity and its exceptional history of that biodiversity. And it is majestic. Whenever I get the chance, I like to go north and visit Tane Mahuta and just wonder at that tree that was already old when the mowers vanished from the land. New Zealand's forests are glorious. They're diverse, they're varied, they're beautiful and rich, and they calm the soul in a way that few forests in my experience do. They are the thing that set you apart, I would argue, as a people, one of the most important things. But they've also suffered wholesale destruction since human settlement. Less than 7 million hectares of native forests remain, much of it on hilly country and steeper lands. Since the initial human settlement of these islands, you've gone from 80% forest cover to maybe 29%. That is a vast and weighty loss. And some forest types in New Zealand are now critically endangered. In 2011, in fact, Conservation International listed New Zealand's forests as the second most endangered in the world. Forests must be seen as more than just a group of trees. Forest gives us vital benefits, Conservation International Policy Chief Olivier Legrand said that year. And you are discovering things continuously in your forests. They are not completely known. And they can form a vital part of this nation's response to the climate change issue. There's a great need, of course, to foster healthy biodiversity. After all, as that quote says, our current climate is the result of our current biodiversity. It doesn't come out of nowhere. This is not a dead planet. It's a living planet with which is the creation of a dramatic chemical imbalance driven by life itself. So our biodiversity is essential to our climate. New Zealand's forests are just so special for a number of reasons. One is that they are moist temperate forests, and moist temperate forests are the most carbon-rich forests on our planet. You have more potential per hectare to draw down carbon and store it permanently than most other places on Earth. But it's very important that you have the right mechanisms in place, as Rob has so eloquently laid out, if you hope to achieve that outcome. What kind of forest New Zealand encourages under its new emissions reduction plans really will matter. And I just want to share with you an experience that Australia went through some years back, where we backed the wrong policy in terms of forestry. Back in the 1990s and early 2000s, Australia developed a Plantations for Australia policy that involved tax credits for blue gum plantations. The result was an acceleration of plantings across the landscape, so good agricultural land sometimes went under blue gums as people's enthusiasm for this tax credit took over. Vast areas of trees were planted where there was no hope of ever harvesting them. Kangaroo Island was a good example, where I think 300,000 hectares were planted. But the port to export the logs was never built. It was clear that what had happened was that incentive, that financial incentive, had distorted the market so severely that people weren't interested in the crop anymore. They were interested in the money, the short-term gain they could get through that credit. That would have been bad enough, but in 2020, Australia experienced the Black Summer fires, and those plantings, blue gum forest plantings, became the focus for some of the most intense fires that the country has ever experienced. Vast areas burned, infrastructure was destroyed. On Kangaroo Island alone, $250 million of damage was inflicted by those fires, which were in no small part driven by that misguided scheme which was incentivising the planting of blue gums. Pinus radiata is an introduced species in New Zealand. Blue gums are native to Australia, but not to Kangaroo Island. But the Pinus radiata is only naturally found in California. And if there was ever a plant that is a fire risk in a changing climate, I know gum trees are pretty flammable, but pine trees are not far behind. So if New Zealand goes down the route of incentivising pine plantations across vast areas of the country as the climate destabilises, as the fire risk increases, and we are now in the era of the mega fire, you will see a heightened fire risk. There's also the issue of the fact that these radiata pines are monoclones, which make them very vulnerable to pest infestations. They're inherently unstable in that sense. And a carbon payment for the planting of pines really risks a sort of carbon mining. You know, what the worst case scenario is that that sort of investment will risk the very integrity of New Zealand's carbon currency. As Rob said, deciding what is a reasonable investment in carbon is not going, that decision's not going to be made here in New Zealand. It'll be made internationally. There will eventually be an international carbon market. And if New Zealand decides that the best it can do is investing in a tree that lives for 50 years as some sort of offset for the use of fossil fuels that would have stayed in the ground for hundreds of millions of years, that will be seen as a debased coinage in the near future. And the carbon markets have seen a lot of this already. I don't know whether you recall, years ago in Europe, there was talk about hot air, these carbon credits that didn't really exist because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So progressively, carbon markets have got much more rigorous about accepting what is a reasonable carbon investment. Native forests, of course, offer that real carbon investment. It's not just that the trees live for 1,000 years or so. It's that the forests themselves can survive indefinitely. After all, that's what they've done here in New Zealand since time immemorial. So we know that that sort of investment is much more equivalent to the CO2 volumes and the permanency of taking CO2 out of fossil fuels. Putting it back in those permanent forests is a much, much more creditable investment. I think that this is the way New Zealand should go. A grand ambition. You've got, at the moment, a target or a promise made to the world at Glasgow that you can't readily fulfil given the current policy settings. And yet you have the mechanisms in hand and the funding in hand, as Rob has said, to actually honour that commitment by replanting your ancient native forests, perhaps with some forestry use, but let's get the job started of planting those forests back across the country, ensuring the future of your biodiversity and the credibility of your carbon pledges. The co-benefits of doing that are just enormous. The biodiversity benefits alone are huge. But you also have the benefits of water filtration and retention on the landscape. Again, a valuable asset as our climate destabilises and changes. Parts of this country are likely to dry out further. Parts may get wetter. But the forests play a mediating role, filtering, storing water in the landscape, preventing floods, preventing landslides, in ways that will save New Zealand valuable dollars into the future. I think this country really has to ask itself now, what sort of legacy do you want to leave for future generations? This is the moment to decide. We haven't got infinite time to deal with this, and certainly in a policy sense, you haven't got infinite time. The decision needs to be made and stuck to. And it's a decision that you should think about as it'll appear 50 years from now. What will your grandchildren make of the decisions that will be made this year and next year in New Zealand in terms of forestry? Will they be left with a fire-prone landscape with worthless carbon credits, or will they be left with the true glory of the nation flourishing, which is its wet, temperate rainforest? That's what we're deciding now. And I think this conference has put you and the nation in a very, very strong position to answer those questions in the best way possible. Thank you very much.
Because I'm a much better moderator than Izzy Fenwick, and I've actually kept Tim on time, we do have time for questions. And Tim is very happy to answer questions pretty much on anything. He will give you the names of all 29 species of fossils that he has discovered or described, if you want them. But he's happy to answer questions. If you have easy questions, I'm happy to answer those as well. But I think it would be useful, Tim, just as a starter, to understand a little bit. Some of you in the audience will know this very well, but just understand the impact of carbon in the atmosphere, because although the conference today is very much about trees, and a lot of the debate has been about which tree, right place, right purpose, I think is probably encapsulates it. But actually what we're trying to tackle is actual carbon and the removal of carbon from the atmosphere, given that we are not very good at cutting our emissions. But can you describe, or just give us, from a scientific point of view, just a run through in terms of the way carbon acts in the atmosphere, but also how carbon, as it's released, actually its impact worsens over time. It's not just a simple matter of release and it stays there as, in effect, 1 tonne of carbon.
That's right, Rob. So the way CO2 works in the atmosphere is that if you put a tonne of it up today, thankfully half a tonne of it will disappear over time into the oceans, into trees and whatever else, but the rest stays there, the residual stays there. And that carbon in the atmosphere captures heat over time. So the CO2 molecule reaches what's called its full warming potential, in other words, the most heat it's going to trap, in about 20 years. And this is one of the problems we face, that we're pre-committing ourselves to a particular outcome by burning carbon today that we don't feel immediately, but will be there in a couple of decades' time.
Yeah. So if the base, again, if you look at ETS mechanisms, it's typically 1 unit enables, or one unit surrendered enables the release of 1 tonne of carbon. But if that carbon is released from burning fossil fuels, which are permanent stores, and the offset mechanism is not permanent, then the imbalance is huge, isn't it?
Well, it is. And I mean, that carbon that we're burning, whether it be from coal in Australia or from oil in the US, I mean, that carbon was last in the atmosphere between 200 and 300 million years ago. Right? It's been out of the system. And that's the way the modern climate has been created. Plants have captured CO2, turned it into carbon, and it's been buried in the Earth's crust, more or less permanently. So we are now digging up that carbon, which would have remained buried for many, many millions of years into the future if we hadn't disturbed it. And we're releasing it instantly into the atmosphere through combustion. And then we're saying, okay, well, look, we'll do that, but the way we'll offset this is just by planting a few trees here and harvesting them in a couple of decades. And you can see how the coinage isn't equivalent. You know, you're dealing with the kind of, I don't know, the Russian ruble on one side and the US dollar on the other. You know, they're not the same thing, and you can't pretend they are. So, you know, carbon markets increasingly are looking for equivalents for the burning of that fossil fuel. So, you know, one of those is what's called carbon capture and storage, and this some people use sometimes direct air capture. They capture the CO2 in the atmosphere and then compress the CO2 and pump it into the rocks where it will go back. So that's permanent storage. There are a few other methods that people can use, dumping seaweed perhaps into the deep ocean, using silicate rocks. But forests can offer the same service if the forest itself is long enough lived. So if you're dealing with a forest that'll be there for 1,000 years, or a tree that'll be there for 1,000 years, that's getting closer to the equivalent, because over 1,000 years Earth will re-equilibrate. The carbon will come out and be stored in various areas. So that is considered in a scientific sense as a much more equitable exchange.
Yeah. So, if you want to ask a question from the audience, because I'm getting some from this very fancy iPad, just put your hand up. I'm not sure what the mechanism is for a microphone, but you could shout. We have one from Trevor Richards, which is timely, given what you've just been talking about. Tim, it's you, have discussed biochar in the past. What is the current position on the rapid interest in biochar for, CDR and international voluntary carbon markets?
Great. Look, that's a great question. And I don't want to make an unwanted pun, but biochar really is a slow burn. Yeah, it is. We thought 20 years ago that maybe we could use biochar to quickly sequester large volumes of carbon in the soil. That promise hasn't really been met because there are so many different feedstocks and so many different processes and so many different outputs. That's not to say that biochar isn't highly useful. It's just to say that it's with each one of those particular applications needs to find its niche and then be scaled up as an industry. So, here in New Zealand you have a leading company that's producing biochar for use as a substitute for coal in steelmaking. So that's Carbonscape is one of those companies doing that. You have other people who are using biochar as a form of soil sequestration and soil enrichment, and all of those things will play their role, but I don't think we can yet see where we'll get that gigaton scalability from biochar. And as Al Gore is fond of saying, the solution to climate change is not a silver bullet, it's lots of silver buckshot. So I think it's fair to say that all of those applications of biochar will be bits of the silver buckshot, but we are yet to see them get to the scale we'd like to see them at.
Okay, so anything? No? Anyone out there? Yes, I better take some from there. So, gentleman down the front there.
There's long been an assumption under the ETS that if you cut down a forest, 75% of it turns into carbon dioxide on the day that you cut it down. How are we progressing on considering wood in use, the concept of a half-life? We can already merchandise a forest and say that this type of forest, 50% of it will go into structural timber, 25% will go into paper, half-life 6 months, structural timber, half-life 30 to 50 years. It does make quite a difference to to how much we stored carbon. Is it going to ever be accepted? Carbon stored in timber in use?
It's a great question, and I think we've got a long way, as you mentioned, towards really fully understanding that. Even timber that's used in construction, and I can only speak from an Australian perspective where we use a lot of pine for framing and so forth. Houses these days, maybe they last 50 years before they're stripped out and renovated, and then what happens to the timber? We don't know. Theoretically, if everything was managed appropriately, it could have a longer life, but it's not the equivalent of the ancient forests that persist so long as a living carbon store, I think. So maybe there'd be some value, and it's worth exploring, but I'm not sure that all bits added up will get to the same value as we'd see with native forests.
And ultimately, I think one of the issues that we have with the way the ETS is currently structured is that if the timber industry can stand on its own 2 feet in terms of production forestry, use of housing and export logs to China, then it should stand on its own 2 feet. But at the moment, if you're claiming carbon credits and then the store of carbon is a lot less than the equivalency in terms of what the release in the market, then it has to get called into question. If you took carbon credits away from plantation forestry, I think then it's a very different discussion. It's basically the industry is then standing on its own 2 feet in terms of what you can sell the product for, not in terms of what it can generate in carbon credits.
Rob.
Sorry.
On the iPad, if someone asks a question from the floor, please repeat the question that they asked, but they're asked the question on a Slido, which people can use also.
You might be able to get some.
Yeah, I've got, this is fine. We have a little bit of time. So I've got quite a few questions here, and then I'll try and get some from the audience as well. So we'll go backwards and forwards on that. But there was a lady in the middle there. Yep.
Hey, just listening to the talks today from a range of speakers, I'm concerned that as a group we think we can calculate our way out of this problem. So I'm interested in your thoughts, Tim, around what we need to be doing at the source of the problem rather than at the locking it up at the end.
Yeah, look, Look, I'm a bit of an outsider, so I don't know the nitty-gritty of exactly what's happening in New Zealand. But what I can see are three really great opportunities. One of them is in transport. Really New Zealand could be rapidly transitioning from the use of fossil fuels in transport to electricity, and you've got a lot of renewable electricity capacity in this country. And maybe that needs to be expanded as well. Maybe you need more offshore wind or whatever to make up the difference. But then there are all of these new technologies to deal with your particular emissions problems, particularly methane. And they are at an early stage, but I can see that those potential solutions could be very valuable, and I think we should be accelerating our pursuit of those solutions. And the third big one is your native forests as a carbon store. Like I said, the moist temperate forests of our planet are the richest carbon stores that exist on the face of our Earth. New Zealand's very fortunate to have large areas of moist temperate forest potentially that could be regrown. So they will be the kind of the gold standard of forestry carbon credits into the future, I think, just because they are so dense in carbon and they are so stable. So those three solutions are the way I'd be looking.
And I think that, again, some of the speakers touched on this today, is that one of the issues around the lack or increasing lack of credibility or scepticism in the offset market is because you have such large anomalies between the tenure of the ability to pollute and the tenure of the offset, and also the action of carbon in the atmosphere. So does 1 tonne of offset, is that the equivalent of 1 tonne of release? And that mechanism, which is at the core of ETS, or of the ETS, doesn't seem to make sense. So I think well, to Tim's point anyway, I think ultimately, if we can set a standard that's measurably higher because of the quality of the offset, then I think there's still a market there. You're still going to have credibility. At the moment, we don't have credibility in the way the offset market operates, and we're getting a few questions on that. Hopefully that's answering some of those points. There's a couple of questions here, Tim, which about carbon storage below the ground, and that again was touched on by some speakers today, but that's an important point in terms of New Zealand native forestry. But another one, a little bit more left field, around, which is not to do with the forestry conference, but geoengineering, direct air capture, cloud seeding, different ways of removing carbon from the atmosphere.
Sure, yeah. Well, look, I'd turn first, Rob, if I could, to that issue of soil carbon and carbon in the ground. By and large, globally, the amount of carbon in the soils is about twice as large as that in the trees above or the plants above the soil. So it's a potentially vast carbon store. It's relatively poorly understood, particularly in grazing lands, but potentially very, very valuable. So I think if we're looking at taking a holistic approach to these forests, you're looking at the carbon in the trees and the carbon on the forest floor and in the soils. All of that should add up, because that is stable, relatively stable, as we go forward in time. I think that increasingly the carbon market will be looking at some of those options like direct air capture and so forth. And could I just outline one that Australia, I think, has an advantage in, and that is the use of silicate rocks. You have some in New Zealand as well. These are rocks that are formed often at the mid-ocean ridges, and they're olivine and other silicate rocks are quite abundant on the Earth, but particularly in Australia. And if you take a kilogram of the highest quality of those rocks and grind it up and put it on an agricultural field, you'll end up capturing 1.5 kilograms of CO2. So we don't do that today because we use fossil fuels to mine and transport rock and process rock, right? So you're going to lose the benefit. But in the future, as transport becomes carbon-free and as industrial processes become carbon-free, we can see that as a great potential. And the co-benefit of using those silicate rocks is that early trials in the US have shown that they enhance crop yields by on the order of 10 to 20% in corn. They probably do the same in other crops because you're releasing fresh minerals as you grind up those rocks. So that is one pathway that looks to be scalable and with an early sort of an economic promise, if you want, for use. In fact, there is one option people are looking at right now, which is very interesting, which is the use of Greenland rock flour. I don't know whether you've heard of it, but it's, the glaciers of Greenland are retreating quickly and there's a lot of ground up rock at the snouts of those glaciers. That has the potential to draw down about roughly 200 kilograms of carbon per tonne. Not as good as the best rocks, but it's still there. And because it's already ground up and it's at sea level, it can be used, on agricultural fields or other areas. So the competition for carbon credits is going to increase in future. Direct air capture is another one. We probably don't have time to discuss, Rob, but it's another potential pathway. So as buyers look into the future for credible carbon credits or ways of drawing down CO2, the kind of softer end of the forestry options, the shorter term end, are going to be looked upon, I think, ever less favourably.
Yeah. Up the back there, sort of 3/4 of the way up. Yeah, that's you.
Hey, one of the problems with carbon markets at the moment is that some countries charge $3 a tonne and others get to $150 a tonne. Do you think there could ever be a unified carbon market or a unified price?
That's a great question. Global carbon markets, well, as Rob said, there's really only two well-developed ones in California and in Europe. But, the economists I speak to say that, ultimately there will be a global carbon market. There may be different prices for different things. Who knows how it's going to work? That's all in the future. But it will be the most efficient way. The bigger the market, the more efficient the allocation of resources in a theoretical sense. So, I think we will see a consolidation of that carbon market. And as I look into the future, I think, where I live in Sydney, or just south of Sydney in Wollongong, we've had incredible climate instability. So we've had 2018, 2019, the driest years on record, followed by 3 years of relentless rain and flood, And you look into the future and you see that climate destabilisation and think, well, what will people be doing in 2030, 2040? My guess is anyone who's got a solution for drawing CO2 out of the air, because by then most of the job of cutting CO2 emissions will hopefully be done, but you can get some of the gas out of the air, will have a very valuable asset. So, at that stage, New Zealand, if you're well on the route to replanting your native forests, that's the best value asset class you can have in that sense. But people will also be chasing silicate rocks and direct air capture and seaweed and perhaps other things. And that does take a global carbon market, because often the place you're drawing the carbon out of the atmosphere, right? That's a global asset, and you're putting it in some cases into the oceans, which are another global asset.
It wasn't discussed a lot today, and probably don't have time to do it, but I'll just add that there's a lot of faith in terms of the ability of carbon markets to solve some of this problem. And one of the things I know about markets is that they're not great problem solvers. They're great at finding ways to make money, but they're not great at solving problems. So I think we've got too much faith in carbon markets, ETSs and the like. And remember, even in New Zealand, the ETS covers only less than 50% of our emissions budget. The European ETS is dominated by financial investors who are not end users. So they're only in there to make money. So the simplest way, which is complete anathema to any politician, the simplest, most logical way is to have a global carbon tax. And I know that's fairyland, that we would never get there, but that would be the simplest, fairest methodology. I think the other thing is that there is an enormous amount we can do outside of ETSs. I think this government should look at the incentivisation of native forestry planting outside of the ETS. We don't need to include if we had to, we could exclude it from the ETS. You're not even talking about the offset market. You would encourage iwi farmers, landowners to plant native forests and lock that away and pay them to look after it in terms of pest control, weed control and the like. And the government would keep all those credits. And it wouldn't have to be in the ETS. And it is absolutely simple to do if there was a will from the government to do it. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to design a scheme like that. So I think we do get tied up a lot with discussions around ETSs and the like, and our point is it is not fit for service, it's not. But there is an enormous amount we could do outside of that as well. So
that's really interesting, Rob. If I could just add a bit to that. Just, you know, what we've learned in Australia is that the use of a biodiversity payment, whether you call it credit or not, has been very effective, in fact, in achieving what we need to achieve. I work with an institution called the Emissions Reduction Fund in Queensland, where we buy what are called ACCUs, Australian Carbon Credits, but we buy them at a higher rate where there's a biodiversity asset attached to them, such as protecting a Great Barrier Reef or protecting an endangered species, and that works very well. And you know, the other thing I've noticed in Australia is that people are moving away from market-based mechanisms for emissions reduction solutions and are going straight to regulation. So we've seen in New South Wales, for example, the new regulations around our clean energy sectors, which are being in place right now, and are oversubscribed, incidentally, as you'd probably know, Rob, in terms of just assets bids. So maybe carbon markets will play a smaller role.
Yeah. Sorry. Down the front.
Yeah, just to make a couple of comments. In relation to harvest wood products, that is in the UNFCCC. New Zealand hasn't enacted it, but it does recognise the fact that carbon is stored in bioproducts post-harvest. Second point to note is nearly all of New Zealand plantation forests are not in the ETS because they're pre-1990. Third point is that when you cut down a forest that was originally ETS, you have to replant or repay. So there is a permanence because there's a penalty if you don't. Fourth, most of the ETS now is an averaging, which only allows you to claim one lot of carbon credits, which is called safeguard, which is about 700 to 800 tonnes. So those forests also commit under covenant to replant and carry on. I just want to come to 2 points, one in your own country's context. So personally, I think we've got to get beyond this plantation native species debate and think about those serving different purposes. Secondly, not enable the ETS to do everything. We've got sustainable finance under the TCFD, which now has an emissions reduction that's associated with financing new business. New Zealand were leading in relation to the document. Australia has a wood supply deficit. A report came out the other day for the next 40 years. At the moment, you get a lot of product out of prior to Ukraine war, out of Eastern Europe and out of Russia. Without plantation forests, how is Australia going to close its deficit? Let's come back to home. In 2050, we have electric cars riding on roads which have bitumen surfaces. We use potentially about 300,000 tonnes of tar a year. We could make that tar from a renewable bioresource. And if we substitute for steel and concrete. So my question is, how much do you understand the 2050 demand side for material to supply industrial heat, to provide 1 billion litres of aviation gas, to provide 300,000 tonnes of carbon? It's not either or, it's an and. 2 questions. What's the demand side in your own, when you come to comment here on 2050? And second, in your own country, there's an opportunity for New Zealand to provide supply into Australia, which would be beneficial for both countries.
Sure. Look, could I? could I just say, in terms of that supply side, I think that, you know, the market is kind of efficient in terms of delivering that. So I'm not anti-plantation at all, but I don't want to see the market distorted by payments that will see inappropriate land use being made. And that's what we saw in Australia under the Forest for Australia Act, which was designed to do, just as you say, and supply forestry product, but it was poorly designed.
ETS price with land use policy.
Well, but the ETS is changing land use policy. So in the Wairarapa, between October and December, so I happen to know this, I was looking at it, there were 10 sheep and beef farms sold, 9 were converted to forestry. They were sold for between $10,000 a hectare and $20,000 a hectare, when normal sheep and beef properties were selling at about $8,000 a hectare. The average price was 15, the highest was 21. 9 of the 10 were sold for forestry. So that only came because the ETS encouraged that investment. You were not going to make money in sheep and beef farming out of those conversions. So it's not right to say that the ETS is not misallocating capital. It is. I agree with you, though, that, and I'd already said that just before you stood up, is that we shouldn't focus as much on the ETS, because I think there's so much we can do outside of ETSs. And as I said right at the start, the ETS is not fit for purpose. It's not. So we're absolutely on the same page here. I think your demand one on 2050 is that if you knew or I knew, we wouldn't be here because we'd be investing and making a lot of money on it. But almost certainly, whatever we're projecting now won't be right for 2050. So even on the EVs, the biggest change in automobiles won't be the shift to EVs, it's going to be the shift to autonomous vehicles. So the demand for road use is going to change dramatically. Currently on an open road, vehicle movements on a motorway are about 2,000 vehicle movements per hour. So we construct roads at the moment to fit that paradigm. What we should know, but we don't strategically think about this in New Zealand, what we should know is that with the introduction of autonomous vehicles, road movement will go from 2,000 vehicle movements an hour to 6,000 vehicle movements an hour, therefore reducing the amount of roading that we will actually need. Further, household vehicle ownership in all countries, certainly in the US and all major cities in the US, is actually declining. It's not actually increasing. Individual ownership of vehicles is a declining amount, not in Asia, but in the US it is. So you can't take a straight line demand curve and go, if we replace ICE vehicles, which is important, replace them with EVs, without factoring in one car ownership and then shared car ownership because of autonomous vehicles and other forms of transport, because we will move to autonomous public service vehicles, which will run very, very differently to what we currently have at the moment, then the demand cycle looks completely different in terms of what road usage will be. So how you extrapolate that out in terms of what the demand would be for tar, I'm not sure. I don't know. But what I do know is that the individual car projections are going to change enormously over the next few decades. Every major car manufacturer in the world says that they can have an autonomous vehicle ready to roll by 2025. So you go, how quickly was EV adoption? EVs, the tipping point was not 50%. EV adoptions, all major car companies in the world are saying they won't make ICEs past 2030. But the tipping point was about 7 or 8% car ownership of EVs. So what's the tipping point for autonomous vehicles? The whole thing about technology is that most changes will happen more quickly in ways that we don't anticipate.
So just to make a point, some demand forecasts have been done for 2050 based on assumptions of supply.
Yeah.
And we've got some bits around 27 to 2030 due to the fact that we deforested 100,000 hectares.
Yeah.
Second is, yes, we understand about that evolution and transport, but there are other demands for materials which come out renewable plantations.
Yeah, and there's no disagreement about the requirement for plantation forestry, but as I said earlier, what you ultimately want is a plantation forestry industry that stands on its own 2 feet. It's not reliant on carbon credits, as you correctly said. Most of the forests are outside the ETS, which is right. What a lot of discussion on was today is what should be included in permanent sinks, and that's really where the focus has been. What is a viable offset, not what happens to plantation forestry in terms of its industrial use.
You ready for another question?
Yeah, sorry.
Tim talked about biodiversity credits, and they came up this morning as a theme throughout this morning's session. Could Tim talk a little bit more about the Australian system and the learning for New Zealand? How's it
Well, the federal announcement about biodiversity credits is really new, and I don't think that the policy has been fully fleshed out, how that's going to be implemented. So it's hard for me to comment on that. But what I can comment on is the Land Restoration Fund biodiversity funding in Queensland. So that's on the order of $100 million a year, and what the way that scheme works, as I said, is the Queensland Government will purchase an Australian carbon credit, which relates to some sort of land management or reforestation process, but they will pay a far higher price for a credit which does several jobs at once. So if, for example, it's riparian plantings along rivers that drain into the Great Barrier Reef, then you're getting a clear benefit to the Great Barrier Reef because you're stopping silt and sediment and chemicals and stuff getting into the waterways that affect the Great Barrier Reef. If the replantings link, for example, habitat for endangered species like koalas, they will attract a higher credit. So that's the way the system works in Queensland. And I've talked to some people who are doing the Chubb report in Australia, which is an investigation into the Australian carbon credit scheme. And most people are pretty impressed with the Land Restoration Fund's approach. So I'm kind of happy that's working well. The federal one, we don't as yet know, but it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out, I think.
Question down. Yep.
I'm with the Environmental Defence Society, and I have to say I strongly endorse your comments, Rob, about the need for biodiversity credits in some shape or form. I think the challenge is how to design it so that it's efficient and so that we can get TK on board as soon as possible. Tim, good to see you again. I last saw you at a climate conference in Adelaide 15 years ago, I think. You had a black beard then.
It was quite more than 15 years ago.
I wonder if you'd like to comment on what lessons there are in Australia about the politics of climate change, not just over the last election, which we know a bit about, but over the last wee while, and what lessons there might be here for New Zealand politicians in respect of that matter.
Look, that's a great question. It deserves a sort of a considered answer, I think. If we go back to the Gillard government elected in 2009, it was a Labor government. They put forward one of the world's first carbon prices. And the implementation of that carbon price was very effective. So it was levied on probably the 100 largest emitters in the country, and the money was invested in various ways. But it resulted in a rapid reduction of emissions that went on for about 18 months. The Abbott government was elected subsequently after 3 years of Gillard. And then we saw a total discarding of everything to do with climate. There was a period where climate was just a dirty word. Carbon was a dirty word. Government wasn't interested. They just set about systematically dismantling everything that the Gillard government had done. And within 9 months of the election of the Abbott government, all of the gains that we'd made in terms of carbon reductions had been obliterated. There was such a rapid growth in carbon emissions. as public sentiment grew around this idea we needed to do something about climate change, conservative governments started to engage upon what I'd call a fair bit of greenwashing. And this involved carbon credits often of a dubious nature, which would be paid to regions to undertake practices that may or may not have involved real carbon sequestration. And we'll know more about this once the Chubb report comes in at the end of this year in a couple of months' time. But certainly there were deep suspicions that some of the things that were being funded were not real. It was simply a greenwashing exercise. So we then got to the point of the election of the Albanese government, and we've seen an emphatic shift again with the implementation of a series of very well considered, I think, initiatives around carbon reduction. The groundwork, though, that allows, I think, is allowing for that success at the federal level is the work done by the states. And whether the states were Liberal or Labor, they've all been on a journey to reduce emissions quite steeply, starting with South Australia, Labor government, but now a Liberal government for quite a while, continuing the policy, through to New South Wales, where a Liberal Treasurer, Matt Keane, introduced probably the most revolutionary climate policy in the nation's history that's resulted now in a very rapid shift from coal-fired power plants to clean energy. And now Victoria, and just in the last few weeks, Queensland, saying that they are going to embark upon the same transition. So I think what we're seeing now is that the movement to addressing climate change and reducing emissions is pretty unstoppable. We'll see ongoing shifts now, and I hope that by 2030 Australia's electricity sector will be largely decarbonised. I think that transport will be well on the way, won't be as advanced, but it'll be well on the way. The industrial processes, as were mentioned here, things like concrete manufacture and steel making, they'll take a bit longer. They might be out to 2035 or beyond. But we can see now the groundwork has been laid for a total transformation of the Australian economy away from a carbon-intensive base through to a clean base.
So we've got a good one here, Tim. It comes from Vincent Heringa, I think. I'm sorry if I haven't pronounced that right. Tim, we are behaving as if this is an incremental problem. What will it take to tip us into urgency?
Well, I attended the Glasgow climate meeting late last year, and it was very interesting because Rob and I go back a long way with these meetings, and the earlier ones were very technical in their nature, the early climate meetings. They then involved a bit of civil society and they got more transparent and more interesting as meetings. But there was always a level of tolerance. Australia would perform badly and the people in the room would treat Australia a bit like the mad uncle at the Christmas dinner. You couldn't be really rude to them, but you could sort of just not be very happy with them, That wasn't the case at the Glasgow climate meeting. Bad behaviour was slammed down. It really was. And the whole mood of that meeting had shifted. And if I could just tell you a little bit of a story about what was happening off-site. So there was 250,000 people demonstrating in the streets of Glasgow on the weekend between the two meeting weeks. And I saw young people there. They were talking about everything from social justice to economic justice and all of these things. And the temptation is to say, oh, they're just a load of fringe people. They're not really going to be that important. But what I realised when I listened to them was what they were saying was, there you are, all of you guys in suits in a room who are deciding the future of the world's energy mix. That's a big thing. So if you can do that, why can't you do something about our social mix or our economic mix to create a better life for people? And they are absolutely right. And they are the ones who will be in the negotiating rooms 20 years from now, I can guarantee you, those committed people. So we are undergoing a great shift. I think that there has been a wake-up at that very high level that this is urgent. Now that sense of urgency hasn't got through to all governments, perhaps the government in New Zealand and various others. But that awareness is there now globally, and increasingly there, I think, even with investors and others, with people who deal with money. And that is all good stuff. I think we'll look back on 5 years and perhaps see that this was a period of slow awakening, but that, you know, the need for action is now. We realise that, and you know, many of the leading groups realise that.
Do one more from here and then take another from the audience, but I don't know, John Johnfield's still in the audience, but probably needs an expert. Could selective harvesting of continuous cover forest increase the carbon capture capability of the forest area?
So the question's about native forest, was it? Yeah. Look, I'm not enough of an expert to know what the case is with that, particularly here in New Zealand. I mean, I could say at a theoretical level, yes, it might work, but who knows what the truth is on the ground. So I think that's an area that you know probably needs some considered study to work out how much you can take out. I did see the talk today by the guy who was doing harvesting of native forests and was saying that in fact the actual yield is well below that of the potential yield. But it'd be good to have a better understanding of that.
Is that John?
Yes, it was.
Is it? John, is he in the audience? He might know. No, that's all right. No one have a pop at that one? Selective harvesting, increasing carbon capture.
I would say that with the...
Stand up,
Speak up,
you're
please.
an expert.
Harvest under the Forests Act ensure that the forest is growing at a greater increment than the harvested level. So quite typically in the northern Pulsita forests, there will often be an allowable harvest rate of often much less than 1 cube per hectare per annum, whereas those forests, as we've seen with some of the figures today, will often be doing 10 or more cubes per annum, so a very small amount of actual harvest.
So the answer is yes.
I think the best answer is it all depends on the forest, on the situation, and a whole lot of factors.
I'll just repeat that because people may not have heard. The answer was that it all depends upon the actual forest and other factors. Yeah.
Okay, so other questions out there? Yes, sorry. Yes, that's you, yeah.
What we see here in New Zealand a lot of is incredibly slow approaches to legislation, and then it gets badly drafted and it gets twisted by special interests, and if it finally makes it into law, it's weak and it's not enforced. Like, what's your experience in Australia? It sounds like you're making so much progress.
Well,
all the
look,
democracy.
Australia is blessed. We have had some exceptional bureaucrats, really dedicated people who actually know how to get the job done. I don't know why that is. Not always the case, but you know it is the case in certain areas. And I don't know what the issue is here in New Zealand, to be honest with you. But I reckon capacity is a key blockage for places like New Zealand. I don't know whether it's the size of the society and you don't have the full skills base you need within government, or is there a reluctance within government to reach outside when they need that skills base? That I don't know. But I think you're right that there is an issue here about just in terms of straight capacity to deliver.
The power of vested interest is too high, and I think in Australia it was very high, and I'm just wondering how you overcame that.
Oh well, look, so vested interests. I should just tell you a bit of a story. I was Australia's Climate Commissioner for 3 years. When the Abbott government came in, they sacked us all. It was their first act of government. And we just decided we weren't going to be sacked. And so we had a very intelligent young woman as our press person there called Amanda Mackenzie. And she said, well, why don't we just crowdfund ourselves back into existence? And I said, well, what is this crowdfunding? This was back in 2013. I didn't know anything about it. And she said, oh, people will donate money. I said, oh, well, okay, well, we'll give it a go. But I was terrified when we stood up and announced we were going to do this. But within a week, we had over $1 million in the bank. And today, we employ precisely 10 times as many people on our team as we had under government. And we have been working away at changing public opinion in Australia. And that has, over time, had a big effect. So we realised we needed to target some of the Liberal, most conservative seats. And we've seen changes now where those long, very secure seats have changed hands on the basis of climate policy. So I think that it's public understanding that's required to change. And once you get sufficient understanding in the public of what's needed, it's very hard for the politicians to back out and say no.
There's a question on this from Lois Easton as well, but it really does get to the point that until politicians think that this is actually really important in terms of votes, they're always going to be slow to act. So if there are more important imperatives, be it crime, hospitals, whatever, then those are always the headline grabbers when it comes to voting. Until such time as we as the voters can go, climate change is the most important issue, you can't really expect politicians to act quickly. Right. There are two. Yeah.
This is a climate change question. So, I mean, basically, we're all out here in the community and we're making decisions on the basis of estimates of risk around climate change. And, you know, that may be whether you're going to plant trees or whether you're going to join Extinction Rebellion or whether you're going to increase defence spending because of mass migration, whatever. And the figure that's used is this 1.5%, that, you know, just from a layperson, you just hear 1.5%. And I think in most people's minds, that's kind of a safe level. And then we think, well, is it going to overshoot? And then people make investment and other decisions by how much will overshoot. But I just wondered if you could tell us, in terms of 1.5, what do you think is the probability, if we just go to 1.5, what's the probability of crossing important tipping points, even at 1.5, if you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because that would help us. So if it's like 0% going across the tipping point, but if it's, say, 5 or 10%, we may decide to, you know, join Extinction Rebellion or invest in carbon capture or whatever. But if we really got the experts said, because 1.5 is a pragmatic level, not a safety level. Other areas of risk management, people normally, the experts give you a safety level and then you trade off. 1.5 is already traded off. But I just wonder if we just say to you, at 1.5, what's the probability of crossing important tipping points? And that would help us to calibrate our response.
Yeah, sure. Look, I should premise this by saying, you know, all of this is probabilistic and no one can predict the future. And when we come to the climate modelling, you know, sometimes the trends get wrong. You know, I was expecting Australia to get drier for a while before it got wetter. It's now the opposite. So in terms of the tipping points, there's a really excellent paper that I'd suggest you read in the journal Nature by Tim Lenton and others, which I think was published probably around a month ago, might be 2 months ago now, that looked at how probability of the tipping points of reaching them or breaching them changes at 1.5 degrees. So they looked at the tipping points, and I'm doing this from memory, so please don't hold me to it, but it was something like 23 tipping points they looked at. And of those, there were 5 that went from basically unlikely to likely at 1.5 degrees. Now, likely means a more than 50% chance. You know, possible, they went from possible to likely. So we're going from less than a 50% chance to over 50% chance.
That's at 1.5.
That's at 1.5. So that is really severely bad news for the world, because those tipping points are the equivalent of positive feedback loops. They feed more carbon into the system and accelerate the shift. So, you know, I try not to talk about that in front of kids because I worry they're carrying enough of a burden as it is. But we adults probably need to face the reality that we've got to move very, very fast now, and we've got to do 2 things at once that we hope we would never have to do, as offsetting shows you. We've got to cut the emissions hard and fast, but we've also got to develop the means of drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere at scale. But do those 2 things at once. And if that's where the mindset is and where government policy is, I think it's doable, but it's not with an offset mindset, yeah? could do something, think about the problem differently.
And just on that, and then we take this question here, is in Glasgow, so that on the basis of the commitments received in Glasgow, the NDCs were on a 2.7 degree pathway.
Yeah.
And that includes a lot of offset commitments and commitments that even New Zealand's commitment in Glasgow, New Zealand Treasury don't recognise that as a liability. So, sorry.
Thank you, Rob. So, I was going to talk about something totally different, but the 1.5 came up. I want to share with you the building we're in here. And the first question was about embodied carbon in buildings. I can share with you now that the embodied carbon in this building is 1.5% of the total value of it and the total carbon stored. And when you look around, you get all this wood around here, but it's all nonsense, it's all just mirrors. But that wasn't what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about, you suggested that in the Wairarapa that you'd seen the farms have been going into forestry and stuff, and anecdotal stuff. So the situation is, in the Wairarapa, there's 2 sawmills and there's a port. So people sell their land to people that want to make money out of land use. So they put it into forestry because there's 2 sawmills, a plywood mill, and a port that takes stuff away. That's why people want to pay more money for land forestry. Now, what I've really started to say is that you're putting your money on carbon and native forestry, and I love native forestry. My native forestry, my conservation credentials cannot be questioned. I spent my younger years trying to save native forests all around the North and South Islands. I won't go into that now. But I realise now in my elder age that if you want to save the country or the planet with carbon, you're not going to be doing it with trees that take 200 or 300 years to sequester. So why is there some sort of animosity about using species that can do it better? I want to talk about a thing called COVID. When COVID came to this country, we locked the doors and we kept it out because we weren't sure what was going to happen. Are we going to die? Are we going to be affected badly from it? We don't know. We don't know about the biosecurity. Do you think that native forests in New Zealand are somehow immune from risks coming in from overseas? That all our biochar forests might be destroyed by organisms from overseas? Are we immune to that? Of course we're not. So if you're going to sequester carbon, you've got to use species that have been exposed to elements.
Read that book. Read that book. That tells you, and that's done by science, not written by me, it's done by scientists in this room, and they will tell you.
Rob,
after,
forest measurer.
After 50, well, if you want to have the argument with the guys that wrote that book, feel free to go ahead and do it.
I'm happy to do it, mate. I'm sorry.
Well,
I'm happy to do it.
They're in the room, go and find them, and I'll back them.
Could I just address that issue you raised about...
Sorry.
Just
let Tim finish.
Respond.
And then we'll take one question, and we've got one more from here, and then that'll be it.
Look,
sorry, Tim.
One of the issues that I raised with allowing a kind of carbon credit for forestry is that it distorts land use patterns. And we know that from Australia, where we went through a really disastrous period where we had a policy called Forests for Australia. And as we heard before, we are short on plantation forestry. So the government decided to create a tax credit to encourage people to plant fast-growing blue gums as forests. They're a native tree. It all looked like it was going to be great, right? But the distortion was such that it led to really perverse outcomes. So people were planting forestry to get that tax credit on inappropriate lands. They were planting them at massive scale in areas where there was no possibility ever of harvesting and exporting that timber. And as our climate destabilised, those blue gums, they're like pine trees, they're highly volatile, they burn well, turned into a catastrophe. So on Kangaroo Island, as I mentioned, where there was 300,000 hectares of these plantings that could never be harvested, there was no port, there was no way to get the timber out, no sawmills. that just turned into a funeral pyre for the island. Honestly, it went up like nobody's business, caused $250 million worth of damage. And that's looked back on in Australia as being a regulatory catastrophe, or a forestry disaster. And that's what you don't want to happen in New Zealand. You don't want people planting trees just for the carbon credit. It has to be a viable market. And in my view, the best way of doing that is by letting the demand, supply and demand, work itself out over time. I know it's more difficult with forestry because it's such a long cycle, but the risk of distorting the market to the point where you get those really bad outcomes is very real, particularly as our climate destabilises. So that's all I'd say as a warning in that regard.
So there was a chair group up the back. There was a collective. Is that one question or 16?
I've been seeing my hand every 5 minutes shoots the air and then just put it down. I think my first question I've completely...
As he's back in this chair tomorrow, it'll be a lot better.
Yeah. I'll try to actually ask a question and not just give my view on this. But look, first I'd say that Tim, I read your book Future Eaters 15, 16 years ago before I was working in climate change, and it really inspired me. So I was very keen to hear you talk tonight. I work in forestry. I work in Permanent Forest New Zealand and Carbon Forest Services. This isn't a plug, by the way, just for context. We're the biggest supplier of voluntary carbon credits, mostly from native forests in New Zealand, and have been for many years. So I like truth and honesty, and I feel like there's a lot of mythology going around in this debate. And I don't like binary debates. It's more nuanced. It's not black and white. And I am upset by the way that this debate has been framed between exotic and Indigenous. Now, sorry, this has gone into a bit of a statement, hasn't it? But look, in short, I feel like I'm living in a parallel universe. I've got climate anxiety. I am very stressed out. I've been working in this space a long time. Things are getting worse. I went to the climate change business conference recently in Auckland 2 months ago. You know what? Guess who was the villain? Forestry, exotic forestry. It wasn't fossil fuels. It wasn't farming. It was exotic forestry. And I now see that Coke is sponsoring COP. And I feel very upset that this whole space has almost been hijacked by big corporate interests, and that right now we should be talking about the climate crisis, which is happening now. We need solutions right now. We don't need blanket radiata pine across the country, but we certainly don't need it to be struck off the table. And I feel like we are playing into, and I don't want to say it's completely intentional, but we're playing into a bit of this. Right now in New Zealand, timber forestry is the easy boot. And we're here talking about this. And farming most of our clients are farmers, by the way, and obviously very important. But why are we not talking about farming? Why are we not talking about reforesting a lot more farms? And so I guess my question to you, Tim, is you said you believe in the technological fix, which we've been hearing for over 20 years with farming. Seaweed, methane reductions. I would like to know from you, if those technological fixes we don't see them happening in the next 5 years, how much of New Zealand's farmland would you think would be appropriate to go back into Indigenous forestry, blanket wall to wall? Because I think this isn't just about exotic forestry, this is about our way of life.
Yeah. Look, can I answer that with a slightly longer timeline, not 5 years, but maybe 25 years? Would that be acceptable? Maybe. Yeah. Look, what I see ahead is a sort of that the climate crisis is going to deepen. People will take actions against climate change, against the threat ever more seriously. And that places that don't act to mitigate that threat are going to be liable to carbon border adjustment tariffs and all sorts of things, or maybe just the market turning against them. I mean, I know in my supermarket, when I look at the dairy shelf, about a quarter of it's not even dairy anymore. And we're just in the early days of this. That's happened pretty silently, I talk to people who are making high quality protein using bacteria, in Finland. Other people who are making meat from cells, not from whole animals, but just cells in a laboratory. In Singapore last month, they gave the okay for using cell line chicken meat in products in Singapore for sale in shops. So there's a lot of things changing and happening, right? And my fear is that unless countries like New Zealand can show some progress in terms of decarbonising these sectors, that you will be in danger of losing your market share. It may not be 5 years from now, who knows? And maybe we'll get to the point where food security is so threatened people won't care where the food comes from, which would be a disaster in itself. But whatever happens, I can see that crisis is going to continue to build. So I think in terms of solutions, the Asparagopsis seaweed solution is a very real one. I know the people who've set up that company to grow Asparagopsis. I know the people who did the initial work on it. And I think that does have the potential to abate methane emissions in dairy and other cattle in a really serious manner. Still at an early stage, although the field trials which are being run by Fonterra are going very well. That's for sure. In terms of how much of New Zealand will be returned to forest, my guess is that a century from now, if we survive and all other things being equal, we'll be getting quite a lot of our protein from vats filled with bacteria. We won't be able to taste the difference from meat in cell lines and from dairy look-alike products. 25 years from now, I'm not sure how much progress will have been made in that way. But and if it is a century from now and we're getting our food out of vats, maybe New Zealand's going to be back to 80% forest again. Maybe you just won't need that land. I don't know, but I can see technological changes that will free up land over time and allow you to put it back into carbon sinks. And it may be that in that future where we are getting more and more of our food from very concentrated, low down the food chain places like bacteria and cell lines, that we'll have the luxury of putting the land back into forest, and that will be seen as a value, because every gigatonne of carbon you draw out of the air is going to count, weigh in the balance. And I should just to give you a sense of how big the challenge is, 1 part per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, so we're currently at about 415 parts. To reduce by 1 part, you need to take 18 billion tonnes of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that's because, as you take CO2 out of the atmosphere, more CO2 emerges from the ocean to take its place till it equilibrates. So the numbers are very, very large. 1 gigatonne of carbon, if you had a seaweed farm the size of South Australia, that'd give you 1 gigatonne a year. 1 billion tonnes a year. So we're talking very, very big numbers. So forest, places with moist, temperate forests like New Zealand with very high carbon sequestration values are going to be, I think, highly valuable in the future.
Okay. Oh, sorry. So we're going to call it quits there. I've got one more question, which is for Tim. I know what the title of the book is already, but it's from Craig Morley, and he would like to know what your next book is on. I know it's on Aotearoa, New Zealand, my favourite country, but I think, is that the title? No.
Well, look, it's going to be, maybe I'm becoming an escapist, but I decided to write a book with my daughter about the biggest shark that ever lived, a thing called a Totus megalodon, which became fascinating for me because it reveals the nature of the world as it was until very recently in geological terms. Can I take a second to tell you, because I'm excited about it. Like, the biggest great white shark that's ever been recorded, 2 tonnes, 2.25 tonnes, right? Orcas, 6 or 7 tonnes. This thing that existed until about 3 million years ago weighed 100 tonnes, right? And it was a carnivore, its teeth are like this. What was it eating? People thought it was eating whales, but it looks like it wasn't eating whales. It was probably eating other sharks, eating other highly predatory gigantic sharks. And it shared the ocean with a thing called Leviathan, which was a carnivorous sperm whale. It was almost the same size, which seemed to have been eating other sperm whales and other whales. So how do you ever get an ocean that's productive enough to have a global population of sharks that weigh 100 tonnes and gigantic carnivorous sperm whales coexisting that weighed 60 or so tonnes. What sort of world is that?
Global warming, you need more volume to get all...
Well, maybe, but there was something different about the world back then. There really was. It was just I can't imagine an ocean productive enough to feed those critters. But it existed until 3 million years ago. So anyway, so I'm kind of fascinated by that whole thing.
So what does that say about your childhood, that you want to write books about enormous sharks that ate other things?
Yeah, I know, exactly.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you for the lively discussion, lively debate. And I think today covered a lot of ground. And I think yes to the points. This is very much about what New Zealand needs to do next in terms of its ability to encourage the sequestration, long-term sequestration of carbon. It is about the credibility of offsets. It is not to the point that we don't want plantation forestry, because clearly as a country we need that, and that is an important, very important industry for us. But the distinction between that and actually creation of carbon offsets and the right methodology for that, but the right methodology in terms of the sequestration of carbon is critically important for us. And unfortunately, and we had a few questions on this, unfortunately, for a small country, we seem to move incredibly slowly on these issues. And we shouldn't. We should be really, really quick on them. But we're not. So the more pressure we can bring to bear on those who make the decisions, I think is super important. Simon has asked me to tell you that because we're having such fun, that the start time tomorrow is 6:30. 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock? 8 o'clock. So Tim Flannery, a pleasure. Thank you. Fantastic as always. And thank you, audience, and thank you everyone online.